This is our first video on Chapter 5, How Sociologists Do Research. In this chapter, we'll be talking about the different methods that sociologists use. Three major objectives. The first objective is to understand the logic and processes of social research. By processes, the steps that it takes to go from organizing a research question to identifying a population to go study, how to study them, how to analyze your data, all those different things. Second, compare and contrast the strengths and weaknesses of the major research methods used by sociologists. As you see in the chapter, and as we'll discuss in the videos, there are several different common research methods used by sociologists, and we'll talk a bit about the ins and outs of those. Finally, discuss key ethical considerations in researching human participants. Any research that involves humans, whether it's medical research and like a trial for an experimental drug, or if it's doing research about victims of domestic violence, or whatever the topic may be. But when you're doing research that involves humans who are active participants in that research, or subjects, as they're sometimes called, there are always issues with ethics and protecting those people as you go throughout the research process. So we'll talk more about those at the end. Before we move forward, I wanted to ask you, if you just had to use your gut reaction, in the past 20 years, has crime gone up or down? So you've got your answer in your head now. I'm guessing that many of you said up. Anytime you turn on the television, anytime you watch the news, all we see are these stories of horrible, atrocious things that have happened. Crimes committed by people. Murders, rapes, robberies, theft, corporate crimes. I mean, so many crimes. But in fact, our crime rate has been going fairly steadily down since the early 90s. This is using data from the FBI's Uniform Crime Report, which is a data set of all the crimes that were processed by police departments. And as you see, property crime vastly outnumbers violent crime. Even that's maybe something that appears counterintuitive at first, based on what you see on the news. But both property crime and violent crime have been going steadily down. In this one, we have the change from 2009 to 2010. This is just one of the more recent. It takes a while for data to come out. As you see, even in that, when you're alone, some crimes went down, robbery up to 10% difference. So crimes are continuing to go down. As some of you may know, there has been in the year 2016 a very slight uptick in crime rates nationally. However, it is still a very small uptick. The trend still stands. Crime is going down. So, why is it that something that seems so common to understand, crime's going up? There's all this crime. You can see it on the news. Those people over there, they're committing crimes. There are, bands of people robbing people in a town near you. We see all those stories, and if we believe them, just without considering them, we would be led to believe that crime is going way up. We need to work on that. It's a huge problem. But in fact, when using systematic observation, what we find is that crime is going down. So I wanted to beg the question then, is common sense really common? So to get you to begin to kind of think about this, pause the video now and go watch the video of Stephen Fry in America at the Iron Bowl. Stephen Fry is a British comedian. You might have seen him if you're a fan of that show Top Gear that used to come on BBC. Kind of hilarious guy, but he goes to the Alabama-Auburn football game, and I want you to go see his reaction to it. So pause now and watch that. Okay, it's kind of interesting how I reacted to it. First of all, it was if all of it was foreign. Every bit of it, nothing of it made sense. But to many of us, and all of us who are football fans, like if pretty great football game kind of atmosphere to go to. It had all the things that you'd expect to see. But if you're a person outside of American culture, and even more specifically outside of Southern culture, or you're not a sports fan, the goings on at a football game seem, I mean, what did he say? He says it's pretentious and laughable and American and all these things. It's interesting to see how a person who's an outsider, for them, common sense, not common at all. Another example from outside American culture is this idea of fan death. And this is a new one for me to hear about as well. And we want to remember, too, whenever we're talking about other cultures, that in general, we're not trying to degrade them by discussing their unique cultural characteristics. Instead, we're going into them with an interested eye, because we have interesting things in our culture as well. But in Korea, there is this fairly pervasive popular notion that fans, like small, desk fans, or the little the floor fans that you can buy, that those can kill people. I've posted a link to the Atlantis, the Attack of the Killer Fans, that you should go take a look at, that talks a bit more about it. And then there's also a video asking Koreans about fan death. Pause now and go take a look at those. So it seems fairly interesting, especially if you watch the video, that for these people, this is common knowledge. Everyone knows fans can kill people. And they seem to have a few different theories about how the blades of the fan can chop the oxygen in the air, that it can, the circulation of the air can make people suffer from hypothermia. But these are, sincerely held beliefs that are fairly common knowledge in their culture. Now, probably not everyone in Korea believes in fan death. However, this is a circulating idea that to them seems normal. All the fans that you can buy in stores have timers on them. They have fail-safes so that they are not allowed to stay on at night. And as you saw in the link of the Atlantic, a governmental organization even published a series of guidelines about how to prevent fan death. So, for Stephen Fry at the Iron Bowl, the British man at the Iron Bowl, and then the Korean concept of fan death, those aren't part of our common sense here in the United States. So, common sense must not really be universally common. But are there examples of things that are common sense even in American culture that aren't actually common? So one example that I can think of is this widespread belief that you shouldn't go swimming within 30 minutes after eating because you'll get cramps and drown. There's absolutely no scientific evidence to back that up, yet probably thousands of kids all summer, every day during the summer, are made to sit, they're chomping at the bits to get back in the pool, but their parents won't let them. The things that we believe might not be real at all is the interesting point for common sense. And it's not the best one in some ways when it comes to thinking about the social world and the way that sociologists are interested in it. So some of the major pitfalls of common sense is that it doesn't take into account cultural differences. It's only common to the extent that two or more people share the same kinds of backgrounds and experiences and cultures. So an example there is this the fan death idea. That's not part of our culture, but common sense should take that into account in order for it to be good, if you will. Second, it's in a logical grab bag. It's unclear how the various beliefs fit together. One way to look at this is we have all these little sayings, these little aphorisms or expressions. So like, for instance, opposites attract, but birds of a feather flock together. At any different point, you could throw one of those out there and be like, oh, well, duh, that's why those people are good at their relationship, because opposites attract. Or it's equally right, depending on the situation, to say, yeah, of course they're in a good relationship because birds of a feather flock together. We have all these different little beliefs and little sayings that we can use to explain the world, but they don't fit together in any particular way, and they often contradict each other. So the early bird gets the worm, but it's the second mouse that gets the cheese. Um, there are all these little sayings that we can throw out, and we use them in our daily lives, but they don't fit together in any particular kind of way. And so a good theory of social life, or the way the world works, should be something that can be applied fairly generally. Finally, common sense really only works in hindsight. You can always use it to look back and say, well, of course that was what was going to happen. But you can't usually necessarily apply the same kind of common sense to one situation that occurred as to another one that might occur in the future. So common sense has some pitfalls. And it goes back to this idea that I told you and during week 1 about how I think as a sociologist, as a student, you need to think about how we're all fish in a fishbowl, and culture is the water. Culture is the invisible force or forces that we learned about in chapter 4 through the social structure that holds things together. And so we can use common sense to make sense of our little area of the fishbowl. But common sense might not be the best thing to do when you're looking at these huge, major, big things that affect millions and millions of people. So, for example, in the state of Florida, where I recently lived, the state legislature passed a law that they would drug test recipients of food stamps before they were allowed to collect benefits. Now, what we know in the literature is that food stamp fraud is fairly minimal, that it does not cost society that much money, and that those programs are really beneficial to the people who need and receive them. We live in a country where a little less than 20% of American children suffer from what we call food insecurity, where they don't have stable food sources. So programs like that make a difference to the people in our country. But by using the logic that the people on food stamps were likely to be drug users, there was no scientific basis for that. But by using common sense, that seemed like the thing to do. People that collect food stamps shouldn't use drugs because they're on food stamps. So, and maybe the people that collect food stamps, we might make a negative judgment about them and say they're the people that are likely to use drugs. And so they made this policy. They spent tons of money to enforce it, and something like 2% of the people that were tested during the time period were unable to receive food stamp benefits because of drug use. So it turns out it was a complete non-issue. So using common sense can be good to explain small little things in our daily lives, but it's not good for public policies that affect millions of Americans.